Okinawa, spring of 1945. A small Japanese island surrounded by a turquoise sea had become a place where every breath smelled of death. For some, it was the last bastion of the empire. For others, just a scrap of land that had to be taken at any cost. For Kenji, a 10-year-old boy with eyes as black as night, this was home. Once he had fished with his father, run barefoot on the warm sand, helped his mother hang rice cakes in the sun. Now, all that was gone. First, the sky began to thunder, then the houses started to burn, and then the people disappeared. His father had left for the war 3 years ago and hadn't returned. His mother said he was a hero, but there was more fear than pride in her eyes. Now they lived in a cave dug into a limestone cliff. It smelled of earth, soot, and human sweat. Soldiers, old men, women with children crowded around. Everyone had the same faces, scorched, tired, without a trace of hope. Commanders walked along the walls and repeated the same thing. The Americans are beasts. They will spare no one. If they come, kill yourselves. Don't give the enemy the joy. The women listened in silence, the men nodded, and the children just remained silent, because they believed the adults. Every day the cave shook. Shells exploded somewhere above. The ground hummed. Stones fell from the ceiling. Sometimes it seemed like it would all end, but silence would be replaced by a new roar. His mother pressed Kenji to herself, whispering, "We'll wait it out. It will all be over soon." But there was no confidence in her voice. She knew that war spares no one. One night the sky flashed. The light was blinding, like the sun falling to earth. His mother only had time to cover her son with her body. The blast threw them against the wall, the air filled with sand and dust. When Kenji came to, it was dark and quiet. He called for his mother. Silence. He touched her shoulder. Cold. Outside it was still thundering, but now the noise seemed distant, as if the war had gone somewhere upwards, leaving him alone underground. He didn't know how much time had passed. He crawled outside and was blinded by the daylight. It smelled of soot and sea salt. The landscape he remembered from childhood was gone. Where trees had stood, there were black stumps, and instead of houses, piles of ash. Bodies lay on the road. Soldiers, women, children. No one moved. Everything around was dead, and only the sea was alive, receding from the shore with a quiet rustle, as if all this wasn't happening to it. Kenji walked, not knowing where. Every step echoed with pain in his legs. He found a bucket with some rainwater left in it and drank until his stomach hurt. Then he walked again. The road led to a field where rice used to grow. Now there were pieces of metal, wheels, shells lying there. He sat on the ground, put his head on his knees, and sat for a long time without moving. He no longer felt fear. The fear had ended with his mother. Only emptiness remained. By evening he reached a village. Only walls remained. In one of the houses there was a photograph of a family, a man in uniform, a woman, a child, just like his. He took the picture and stuffed it inside his shirt. Then he heard the noise of engines, first one, then dozens. The sky filled with a roar. Planes flew low, silver, with white stars on their wings. Kenji pressed himself against the wall and closed his eyes. He expected an explosion, but it didn't come. Only wind. He opened his eyes and saw cylinders falling from the planes, not bombs. One fell nearby and didn't explode. He approached and saw paper, leaflets. They had words in Japanese. Surrender. We do not kill. Lay down your weapons. He didn't understand why the enemy would warn them before death. At night, he hid in a basement where a shop used to be. It smelled of rot all around. He heard shouts, gunfire, then footsteps. Someone was speaking loudly, confidently, in a foreign language. A flashlight beam swept across the floor. He froze, clenching his fists. The footsteps approached, then stopped. Someone said something short. The light went out, and everything fell silent. He lay like that until morning. When he woke up, the sun was standing over the sea. A canteen lay near the entrance. He thought it was a trap, but thirst won. The water was clean. He drank and couldn't stop. That day he dared to go out to the road for the first time. Strange machines, American tanks, stood on it. Soldiers sat on the armor, laughing, smoking. One threw a can, another caught it. They were alive, ordinary, not monsters. Kenji stood behind a hill and watched. A strange feeling rose in his chest, similar to what was once called hope. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to die. Kenji sat behind the hill and watched the Americans for a long time. They seemed different, almost unreal. Their faces were open, calm. They didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't hit anyone. One of them was telling something and the others laughed. It didn't fit in his head. Enemies shouldn't laugh. The boy remembered how Japanese soldiers said that Americans drink children's blood, that they have no heart. But before him stood ordinary men. They had the same faces, tired, but alive. They ate from cans, shared cigarettes, looked at the sky. He lay motionless until the sun disappeared behind the sea. When night began, the American camp lit up with soft lights. Lanterns swayed in the wind, a radio crackled somewhere. The air smelled of coffee and roasted meat. Kenji couldn't sleep. He looked at this light and felt a strange, forgotten feeling rising in his chest. Hunger. Not just physical, but spiritual. He remembered his mother, how she once gave him her last rice cake and said, "Eat." In the morning he was found. A loud voice, a beam of light in his face, and he flinched, covering his head with his hands. Someone shouted, "Hey, kid!" He didn't understand the words, but understood the tone. He was grabbed by the shoulder, lifted up. He screamed, tried to break free, but the hands were strong. The soldier looked into his eyes, frowned. Another approached, said something, and the first one stepped back. Kenji expected a blow. Instead, they handed him a canteen. Water. He didn't believe it. At first he just looked, then cautiously took a sip. The soldier smiled and pointed to his mouth. "Drink." He drank and trembled. The Americans talked among themselves. One laughed, another took off his helmet. Soon they gave him a can, strange, heavy, smelling of meat. He tried it and recoiled, too salty, too tasty. The soldiers watched him eat and didn't interfere. One of them took out chocolate, broke it and held it out. Kenji looked at the bar, then at the face. There was no malice there, only tiredness. He took a piece and cried. The soldiers exchanged glances. One knelt down, said something quietly, almost in a whisper. Then he took off his jacket and put it over the boy's shoulders. It was too big, smelled of tobacco and sweat. At that moment the fear disappeared. Kenji understood that these people would not kill him. They didn't know his language, didn't know who he was, but they did what no one else had, gave him warmth. Everything after that was like a dream. They put him on a truck where other island residents sat, old people, women, children. Everyone was silent. Someone was crying. The Americans drove slowly, trying not to jolt them. On the way, tanks passed by, raising dust. Kenji looked at the mountains where the fighting was still going on. Shots thundered there, but everything seemed distant, as if he was no longer there. When they arrived at the camp, the sun was setting. Soldiers helped people get out, gave them water, bandages. Kenji didn't know where to go. One doctor, tall and gray-haired, noticed him, bent down, examined his hands, legs, then said, "He's okay." Kenji didn't understand the words but heard the tone, soft, like his mother's when she said it's all right. He was taken to a tent. It smelled of medicine. A week passed. The camp grew quiet. The Americans no longer shot. Now they built, repaired, shared food among the island's residents. For Kenji, everything seemed like a dream. He woke up in the morning and heard soldiers laughing outside the tent. Sometimes they turned on the radio, from which an unfamiliar language and music flowed, light as the wind over the sea. He didn't understand the words, but the rhythm was memorable, as if life had sound again. The doctor came every day to check the wound on his arm, smiled and said, "Good boy." The nurse with blue eyes brought food, soup, rice, a piece of bread. She gestured how to eat, and he nodded, trying not to look directly into her eyes, though deep down he wanted to. Gradually the fear faded. Every day, more and more people were brought to the camp. Women, old people, children. They were also afraid, but seeing that the Americans didn't shoot, they began to talk, whisper, give thanks. At night, Kenji heard someone praying, and for the first time, not from horror, but from hope. He often went out to the sea. Where boats used to be, there were now wreckage, but the water was still clear. The sun set slowly, coloring the sky red, and it seemed as if the whole island was exhaling. One morning he saw a group of Americans loading boxes onto a ship. Among them was the one who had given him chocolate. Kenji stood by the road and watched. The soldier noticed him, nodded, and approached. He took a small photograph from his pocket. It showed a woman and two children. He pointed at the photo, then at himself, and then at the boy. "Family," he said. Kenji didn't understand the word, but understood the meaning. The soldier smiled and held out another bar of chocolate. Kenji took it with both hands, as if it were a gift from the gods. Then the American patted him on the shoulder and left. The boy stood for a long time watching him go, until he realized that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. With each day, the camp grew smaller. Planes flew away, tanks moved north. The soldiers packed their things. People said the war was ending. Kenji didn't know what that meant, the end of the war. For him, the end was when he lost his mother. But watching the Americans wave to children, give away leftover food, simply. The next day, the Americans left the island. In the morning, the sea was empty again. Only tents and a few boxes labeled "Relief" remained in the camp. People dispersed to their villages, and Kenji stood on the cliff, watching the ships disappear over the horizon. He held the drawing in his hands and thought about those who had left. They weren't monsters. They were just people who also wanted to go home. Several years passed. Kenji grew up, started learning English. He dreamed of going to where those who had saved his life lived. He didn't know their names, but he knew, if somewhere on earth there is a place where strangers can save an enemy's child, then the world still has a chance. Years passed. The world changed, and Okinawa was no longer a wound buried in the ground. Houses grew on the sites of old trenches, rice swayed in the fields again, and children laughed where shells once fell. Kenji now lived in the city, working as a translator at an American base. His Japanese accent still sounded harsh, but his eyes always warmed when he spoke English. He was in his early 30s when one day he heard the melody of a harmonica again, a simple, drawn-out sound, just like back then in the camp, when a foreign soldier first gave him chocolate. His heart tightened, as if he had returned to childhood. He went outside, looked at the sunset. Where the sun touched the sea, the sky was the color of copper. The wind smelled of salt and something familiar. In that moment, he understood that he was living not to remember the pain, but to not forget the kindness. Everything that was in the war, fear, hunger, loss, dissolved in one instant when a stranger gave him water and a piece of chocolate. A few years later, he went to America. Not for money, not for a career. He just wanted to see the land from which those who had saved his life had come. He flew to California, and when he stepped off the plane, the same smell hit his face. Tobacco, gasoline, sea air. He stopped, inhaled, and understood that the circle had closed. People around him laughed, hurried, lived, and for the first time he felt himself part of something bigger. He worked as a translator in a small school where they taught Japanese. Sometimes children asked him, "Did you see the war?" He answered, "Yes, but the main thing I saw is peace." He didn't tell them that he was the boy who hid among the bodies. He didn't say how he first saw the Americans and thought he would die. He just smiled, because all that remains somewhere far away, in that silence where strangers handed a child a canteen of water. Once, he was invited to an Okinawa memorial. A white monument stood on a hill, and around it, thousands of names. He found the place where their cave used to be. Stones were overgrown with moss, everything looked peaceful. The wind stirred the grass, and the sea sounded exactly the same as when he first emerged from the ruins. He knelt down and placed a piece of chocolate on the ground. It was his way of saying thank you. He didn't know the name of that soldier, didn't know if he was alive, but deep down he felt, a person who once gave water to an enemy cannot just die. He lives in every kind deed, in every child who learns not to be afraid of strangers. When the sun set, Kenji stood on the edge of the cliff and looked out at the sea. The water reflected the fire of the sunset, and it seemed as if everything around was burning, but not from war anymore, from life. He thought that perhaps if the Americans had passed by that day, he would have died, and with him, faith in humanity would have died. But they didn't pass by, and now the world had become different. He turned and walked down the path, feeling the wind playing in the folds of his old jacket, the very one that a foreign soldier had once thrown over his shoulders. An old photograph lay in his pocket, a house, a sun, a tree, and a boy next to it. The paper had faded, but the lines remained. Kenji smiled and whispered, "Thank you for not shooting." The sea roared just as it had many years ago, and in that sound was everything, the pain and the peace and the memory of those who once proved, even in war, a person can remain a person.